Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us today for the very first session of our ASD exam webinar series. I am Doina Tatu from Cloud Academy, and I'm happy to introduce to you our very amazing AWS experts, our senior AWS certification specialist, Danny Jesse, and our senior AWS content creator, Alana Layton, who will take you through all the latest updates to the AWS Certified Developer Associate Certification exam. I'd like to remind you a few things. First of all, remember that at the end of the session, we will have a live Q&A, so please don't forget to submit your questions in the question box. Secondly, remember that this webinar will be recorded and shared with you via email within the next 36 hours. And last but not least, at the conclusion of the webinar, there will be a brief survey, and we'd really love to have your feedback there. It will help us improve the content we offer and your future webinar experience. So please take a moment to fill that out at the conclusion of this session. So that's all from me for now. So without further ado, I'll let Danny and Alana take the lead from here.
Thank you so much, Doina, and welcome everyone. Again, this is the ASD exam webinar series, and today we're going to be talking about the updates to the AWS Certified Developer Associate Certification, given the exam code DVA C02. As Doina said, I'm Danny Jesse, AWS Certification Specialist, and I'm joined by Alana Layton, if you'd like to say hello to everyone.
Hey everyone, my name is Alana Layton. As everyone already said for me, I'm an AWS content creator here at Cloud Academy, and I'm super excited to be here supporting Danny as we go through some of the core information about the Developer Associate Certification.
Thank you so much. So quickly taking a look at our agenda for today, we're going to cover the exam details. We'll go through understanding the exam requirements as spelled out in the official exam guide from AWS. We'll talk about how to tackle exam questions. So once you're in that exam mode and you have those questions in front of you, what are some strategies that you can follow to make sure that you are getting the best score possible? We'll talk through the logistics of booking your certification exam, and we'll go through some of the frequently asked questions that we receive here at Cloud Academy pertaining to this certification, as well as just AWS certifications in general. And then we'll wrap up with that live Q&A. So as Doina said, make sure that you are submitting your questions in the question box, and we will have a dedicated time to go through those.
And if you ever wanted to know what our favorite color was or what we're going to eat for dinner, those questions are allowed too.
They are encouraged, in fact. I love those questions. You won't see them on the exam, but lots of fun to talk about. So looking at the exam details here, registration is now open. Registration opened on January 31st for this latest version of the exam, and it is available to take beginning next Tuesday, February 28th. So right now, you would still be sitting the DVA C01 exam, but beginning Tuesday next week, it will be DVA C02. Like its predecessor and like the other associate exams, there is a minimum passing score. It's scaled, it's on a scale of 100 to 1,000, and a minimum passing score is 720. And you will receive 65 questions total that you will have 130 minutes to answer. So that works out to about 2 minutes per question. So you definitely want to be mindful, getting a little ahead of ourselves talking strategy here, but you do have about 2 minutes per question as you go through this. Keep in mind that of those 65 questions, only 50 of them are scored. 15 of them are unscored. Unfortunately, they don't tell you which ones are scored and which ones are unscored. So you want to answer them all. You want to give them all your best effort. The questions are mostly multiple choice, where you'll have a question and a series of 4 answers, of which one will be the correct answer. But there are also some multiple response questions where there could be 5 or 6 answer choices and 2 or 3 could be correct. And unfortunately, there is no partial credit on those types of multiple answer questions. You do have to get either both or all 3 of the responses correct to receive any credit for the question. And there is scaled scoring involved, so not all questions are weighted equally. They're based on the difficulty of the exam and the difficulty relative to the sets of questions that other folks who take the exam get as well. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, I need to pass this percentage of the questions because of that scaled scoring. It remains a bit of a mystery, unfortunately. So you want to give it your best, make sure you're answering every question, and understand that there is no partial credit for the multiple response questions. And the cost for the exam is $150 US.
Absolutely. And, going back to those questions that are scored and unscored, I've received this question in the past of, well, why is there 15 unscored questions? And that's because AWS is constantly introducing new questions into exams. And those questions do have to go through a testing phase. So they're kind of using us as their guinea pigs, if you will. So that means that if you see a question that you think could use some work, you do actually have the option of leaving feedback for the question. I've done this before. Granted, of course, you want to make sure you're not eating up your time to leave that feedback, but you can leave that feedback if you see a question that's a little weird.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of times folks are so intent on just getting through the questions and answering them, but you do have that opportunity to provide feedback as well.
Absolutely.
So going through the exam guide, the exam is broken down into a series of 4 domains. And those domains, we'll go into detail on each one, are development with AWS services, security, deployment, and troubleshooting and optimization. So you see there's some percentage weightings on those. Obviously, questions are going to span the boundaries of these domains, so it's not necessarily as simple as, oh, a third of my questions are going to be just about development with AWS services. You're likely going to see questions that involve multiple domains at a time. But now we're going to dive into these domains a little bit further, and I'll kick it over to Alana here to talk to us about domain 1.
Absolutely. So it's no surprise here that this is a developer exam, that the largest portion of the test is development with AWS services. So what really falls into this category? Well, we can see that there's the 3 big services here on the right-hand side of the screen, which are all serverless services. And really what you want to understand for this exam is the design principles, not just around serverless development, but also serverful development. So one of those big design principles of the cloud is to keep things stateless, for example. And so stateless means that you're not just requiring the server to retain information about the state, you're sort of offloading that to a third-party storage system, if you will. So a question you might get on the exam is, if you're managing session data, would you manage that session data on the server itself, or could you manage it off in a system like Elasticache or DynamoDB? What would be better? And of course, the idea here would be put it in a third-party storage system like DynamoDB and Elasticache and get it off the server. That way you can treat your servers like cheap commodity machines, and you can scale better, you can treat them ephemerally, you can make them stateless, and that's ideally going to be the best option in terms of development. And then also you might see things like asynchronous versus synchronous communication. This is sort of going back to a decoupling discussion, where if you can offload your messages into something like a queue, that might be a little bit better in terms of scaling your architecture out so that your messages aren't lost if you require a response synchronously. So keep in mind that you might not get direct callouts of these words in the questions themselves, but you do have to understand the big picture concept so that you're answering the question in the right way. And another one I'll point out is event-driven architectures on the slide. You're going to see that a lot on the exam. And so this basically just means you're triggering workflows based on events. So for example, if I placed a photo in an S3 bucket, and as soon as that photo is uploaded, a Lambda function will kick off to resize that photo. Well, that's a very simple event-driven architecture, and you're triggering that Lambda based on an S3 event. So in the certification, you'll want to understand what triggers Lambda functions and what can kick off those sort of workflows. So that's the basis of development. Danny, you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit on everything. Again, definitely with event-driven architectures, understanding the sources of those events, understanding how you can leverage things like EventBridge, or potentially if you have streaming data from maybe DynamoDB streams tied to Kinesis, things of that nature as well. But definitely developer exam, I shouldn't be surprised to see a developer-heavy focus on the first domain here.
Absolutely.
And it should also not be surprising that there is almost equal weighting given to domain 2, which is security. So when we talk about security, we're going to be talking about having our custom applications deployed in the AWS cloud. We're going to need to probably implement some various authentication and or authorization mechanisms for applications as well as for AWS services. So you're going to see things like Cognito featuring pretty heavily in this, understanding the difference between Cognito user pools for authentication, Cognito identity pools for things like authorization. You see a scenario where you have an application where you need to have access given to unauthenticated users. That's going to be a use case for identity pools. Talking about implementing encryption using AWS services. We're going to see later on in this session, we're going to talk through some sample questions, and one of them is going to involve the principle of envelope encryption. So understanding how to perform encryption client side as well as server side. So knowing what your encryption options are for a service like S3, knowing how to use KMS, so whether to use AWS managed keys, customer managed keys, even potentially a service like Cloud HSM, a dedicated hardware security module for managing those keys. And then the last point is managing sensitive data and application code. So this is things like connection strings, environment variables, knowing some best practices around how to handle credential management. Obviously, if you see answers that involve hard coding credentials directly in code, probably pretty safe to discard that as the right answer, right? So best practices, using something like AWS Secrets Manager, in particular, if you see any references to having credentials automatically rotated for you, you definitely want to be looking towards a service like AWS Secrets Manager to handle that. Encryption in transit and at rest. So having server-side certificates, using AWS Certificate Manager with a service like CloudFront perhaps, and then secure credential handling and understanding the principle of least privilege. So you might see questions around, what is the appropriate level of permission to grant a developer who might need read-only access to something. And so if you saw something like an admin policy or a full control policy as opposed to a read-only policy, that principle of least privilege should guide you towards, again, that minimum subset of permissions necessary to accomplish the task. Anything you want to add about domain 2?
No, you pretty much covered it. I think one of the biggest things, and you'll see this too in the sample questions, is just understanding the use cases of these services, when to use them and when they're not appropriate. And also some of that functionality that differentiates the services between each other, like Systems Manager, Parameter Store versus Secrets Manager. Those are two services that you can use for the same things, but they offer different functionality. So just understanding that is going to get you pretty far, I think, in this exam.
Absolutely. So that's domain 2. I'll kick it back over to you for domain 3, which is deployment.
Awesome. So we talked about the code, we talked about securing the code, and now what's next? We got to get it out there. So this is sort of a domain that's focused a lot on CI/CD and, of course, deploying your code using services even like Beanstalk to get that information to your users. So you'll see code commit, code build, code deploy, and code pipeline on the exam. And it's helpful to understand not just how these services operate individually, but also how they can be pieced together so that a piece of code can go from being committed into code commit to being built into an artifact using code build, and then deployed out to your compute using code deploy. So you'll need to understand that, as well as some infrastructure as code design principles. So CloudFormation will be on this exam as well. And it's going to be helpful to understand how to deploy new versions of your application using CloudFormation as well as code deploy. And then some of the methods you can do that with. So for example, with code deploy, depending on where you're deploying your artifact, you'll want to understand exactly how to deploy that new version. So things like using a blue-green strategy or a canary, linear, or all-at-once strategy, you'll want to know the differences between all of those strategies and when you'd use each. And then it's no surprise that in AWS, another big design principle is to ensure that you're safely rolling back your code. So you'll want to understand with code deploy that you can automatically and manually roll back, and with CloudFormation, you can roll back stacked operations. And in fact, it's the default setting with CloudFormation. So a question might be on the exam, well, a CloudFormation stack failed. What happens to the resources that CloudFormation created? Well, in that case, the default behavior would that it would roll back the creation of all those resources, and that would be the answer. Anything you want to add there, Danny?
That's great points all around. I think also with some of the deployment strategies, understanding when using a service like Code Deploy, what types of deployment strategies are available to you based on whether you're deploying on premises or to fleet of EC2 instances or Lambda functions, things of that nature as well.
Definitely.
And for code pipeline, being able to, this kind of ties into the event-driven architectures we talked about, having sort of approval processes, manual approvals as part of your code pipeline process, and how to integrate services maybe like SNS to handle that.
Awesome. Yeah, notifications using SNS, that's a big call out. I think that's really important. You'll definitely see that mentioned on the exam.
And last but not least, we have the final domain, domain 4, which is troubleshooting and optimization. So this domain is going to have you kind of put your developer hat on for debugging and also for troubleshooting. So assisting in a root cause analysis, using a service like AWS X-Ray to instrument your code for observability. Obviously, services of interest here are going to be CloudWatch and CloudTrail as well. CloudTrail, obviously, for managing all of your logs, any API calls that are made, you would be looking towards your CloudTrail logs to do further analysis of that. In terms of CloudWatch, it'd be helpful to know kind of the standard behavior for the sort of metric data that's captured and collected every 5 minutes, and how you can perhaps enable some detailed monitoring to get that down to a 1-minute interval. If you see a question that calls out in particular request tracing, downstream calls, microservices, things like that, you'd be looking towards X-Ray, understanding the use cases for the X-Ray daemon and where you might need to install or configure that as well. Just thinking through, again, sort of, CloudWatch, knowing how to do enhanced monitoring for RDS. And then in terms of X-Ray, knowing about segments, subsegments, annotations, and metadata as well. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one thing, great points all around, of course, but CloudWatch and CloudTrail, knowing the differences between those two, that's important, not just for this certification, but I feel like it's talked about on every certification. Just understanding that CloudWatch sort of monitors your AWS resources, and CloudTrail, on the other hand, records all your API activity in your account. So just understanding those two services, that'll get you probably at least one question.
Excellent. So those are the 4 domains as spelled out in the exam guide with the various objectives and services of interest. So now we're in exam mode. We're getting ready to take that exam. We've got our 130 minutes. We're C question 1. What are some strategies that we can follow to tackle these exam questions, make sure that we are not falling for any of the distractors, we're not being distracted by any irrelevant information within the question? So the first thing you want to do, obviously, you want to read that question from beginning to end. Try not to latch on to any 1 or 2 things you see early on. You want to make sure you're reading that whole question, and then you want to strip that question down, remove any information that's not relevant. So at the associate level, the questions tend to be a little bit shorter than the professional level, but there's still opportunity for things like a financial services company is doing something, or you are developing a gaming application or a cryptocurrency something. And all of those things are rarely, if ever, relevant to the substance of the question itself. So you generally want to be clear about what the question is asking. And as we say here, it's usually defined in the last few words of the question. So there's usually some sort of introductory statement, and then they get into the meat and the substance of the question. So really focus from beginning to end, but especially towards the end of the question. That's where you're generally going to see the item or items that are going to make it clear exactly what they're looking for. What is the most efficient way to do this? What is the best service to do this? So once you've read that question from beginning to end, you want to look through all of the answer choices. Again, don't look at A and immediately think that's correct and not even bother reading B, C, or D. remove obviously incorrect answers. Once you've narrowed the selection, reread the question. And again, at the associate level, I tend to find that there's usually at least one or two of the 4 multiple choice answers that you can remove that are obviously incorrect. And then from there, having just 1 or 2 or 3 maybe choices to choose from, reread that question, then go back, analyze those answer choices again, rinse and repeat, being mindful of the fact that you do have about 2 minutes per question as you go through this. So you don't want to be spending too much time on the early questions and kind of get behind the 8 ball there where you're then having to rush through to get through your last 30 questions in 30 minutes. You definitely don't want to get into that situation either. So there is a timer that's counting down in the top corner of the screen as you're taking the exam. Be mindful of that as you're doing this, but also never leave a question unanswered. So if you go through this process a couple of times and you can't narrow it down between 2 or 3 answers, whatever you do, don't leave it unanswered. There's no penalty for guessing. If you leave it blank or if you get it wrong, it's going to cost you the same. So always, always, always answer every question. Any other points you want to add about that?
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. I would say if you're spending a lot of time on a question, like Danny said, make your best guess, answer the question, but you can also mark the question and go back to it if you have extra time at the end of the exam. So keep that in mind. You have that ability to go back and reread and re-answer questions. So keep that in mind.
That's a great point. You can flag questions for review at the end as well. Sometimes they say, generally speaking, going through the exam, there aren't going to be any hints given in any questions that'll help you answer any of the other questions, but sometimes you might read something that might trigger something in your mind that might make you realize that you didn't give the best answer to a particular question. So if there is anything you're uncertain about, flag that question. When you have time at the end, you can go back and review just those questions you flagged. So moving on, let's apply these principles and go through some sample questions. These are from the official AWS exam guide sample questions set. And what we'll do, I'll read through these questions and then we'll apply some of what we just talked about in terms of how we can go about narrowing down obviously incorrect answers, rereading the question, seeing what the question is asking for, and see how we arrive at the correct answers for these. So sample question 1. A company is migrating a legacy application to Amazon EC2 instances. The application uses a username and password that are stored in the source code to connect to a MySQL database. The company will migrate the database to an Amazon RDS for MySQL DB instance. As part of the migration, the company needs to implement a secure way to store and automatically rotate the database credentials. Which solution will meet these requirements? So obviously this is a longer question. Not all of the associate level questions are this long, but picking through what they're actually asking for. The company is migrating a database instance to RDS. They want to implement a secure way to store and automatically rotate the database credentials. So here you see an example where that first sentence is, a nice introduction, not really relevant to what is being asked for here. The question, which solution will meet these requirements? In this case, the requirements involve a secure way to store and automatically rotate database credentials. So with that in mind, how would we go about looking at these 4 answers and narrowing them down?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Danny said, it's kind of like the first couple of sentences here are kind of worthless. So understanding the secure way to store and automatically rotate the database credentials, that sentence really covers all of it. And so now we can sort of narrow it down. And the best way to do this is just read through each one. So A, store the database credentials in environment variables and an Amazon machine image, and then rotate the credentials by replacing the AMI. Well, that's really not the best option, right? As AMIs are typically shared. And so that increases your exposure of your credentials to others. And baking credentials into an AMI is a pretty poor security practice because it goes against the temporary nature of credentials. So it's a better idea to store these credentials in a place specifically designed for them, such as a secrets manager, right? So that's A, probably not the best option as it increases our exposure.
Right, looking at answer B, store the database credentials in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store, configure Parameter Store to automatically rotate the credentials. Well, at least this sounds a little more plausible than answer A, using some sort of parameter store to store these credentials. So this might be one that I would say this could be right, although if I knew that parameter store did not have the ability to automatically rotate those credentials for me, I would be able to rule that out right now as well.
Right, right. So potential option, we can come back to it after we read through all the other ones and see if that's the best choice. So let's move on to C.
Yeah, storing the credentials in environment variables on the EC2 instances. That doesn't sound like a good practice, but I'll continue reading this one just to be sure. Rotate the credentials by relaunching the EC2 instances. Well, that doesn't sound plausible at all, right? So this is probably one that we can definitely throw out.
Yeah, pretty dangerous, if not even actually possible.
And you will definitely see plenty of instances where these sorts of approaches appear as potential answers. Hard code the credentials on the within the instance, things like that. Things as good developers are not good best practices. We can rule those out right away. Obviously, AWS in the course of their certification process is not going to be encouraging those sorts of bad practices.
Absolutely. So remember, if you store your credentials in files, it's going to end up in version control. And AWS is aware of that and makes use of those use cases in these exams.
Absolutely. So looking at answer D, store the credentials in AWS Secrets Manager. Sounds good. Configure Secrets Manager to automatically rotate the credentials. We know that Secrets Manager can automatically rotate credentials. That sounds like probably the answer I want to go with. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good option. So, I mean, we're between B and D, right? What makes you lean towards D?
The fact that it needs to automatically rotate the credentials for me. And I know that parameter store can't do that.
Absolutely. So this takes some service-specific knowledge to answer this question, right? So in this case, you'd have to know that parameter store doesn't provide that automatic rotation of stored secrets, and Secrets Manager does. So that's our answer.
There you go, answer D. So hopefully that approach makes sense. We're going to go through a couple more sample questions just to further enhance this process. Looking at sample question number 2, a developer is adding sign up and sign in functionality to an application. The application must make an API call to a custom analytics solution to log user sign in events. Which combination of actions should the developer perform to meet these requirements? So this is a multiple response question. It's telling us to select 2, and they will always tell you whether it's a select 2 or a select 3. But we have to choose 2 of these 5 options. So you'll notice, generally speaking, when you see a question like this, you're going to be able to kind of divide the answer choices that are given to you in probably 2 buckets, where you're going to be able to say, okay, a couple of these must be the first thing that it's talking about, and the rest must be the second thing that it's talking about. So let's see how that applies here. So A, use Amazon Cognito to provide the sign up and sign in functionality. B, use AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM, to provide the sign up and sign in functionality. So there we see here A and B. Obviously, I'm probably going to need to choose one of these to provide the sign up and sign in functionality. Now looking at answer C, configure an AWS config rule to make the API call when a user is authenticated. D, invoke an Amazon API gateway method to make the API call when a user is authenticated. And E, invoke an AWS Lambda function to make the API call when a user is authenticated. So based on the similarity between subsets of these answers, I pretty much know I need to choose one of the first 2 to provide my sign up and sign in functionality, and one of the last 3 to make that API call when a user is authenticated. So now that I know that much, how can I start to narrow this down further?
I say let's start with looking at both A and B together and choosing one of those, since we know that we have to. So Cognito versus IAM, which one is going to provide us that application sign up and sign in functionality? Well, with IAM, we know that that provides us AWS authentication and authorization, right? But not necessarily our application authentication and authorization. We do know that Cognito does provide that. So I'd say that that's probably the better option.
That does sound like the better option of those two. So I can probably say one of my choices is going to be answer A, and the other choice is probably going to need to be C, D, or E. So now we're talking about, okay, making the API call when a user is authenticated. Would I configure an AWS config rule to do that? Probably not. And again, this is where that service-specific knowledge comes into play, knowing what AWS config is for. Definitely not a service I would think about when it comes to making API calls as part of my application.
Yeah, you'd use config more when you want to evaluate whether your resources comply with best practices. So maybe if the question asked if you wanted to check if all your EBS volumes are encrypted and report back which ones aren't, then maybe config would be the better option. But it doesn't ask that, so config's definitely not an option here.
So now we have one of our two answer selections, and now we know we need to choose between probably D or E for our second choice. So now, am I invoking an Amazon API gateway method to make an API call, or am I invoking an AWS Lambda function to make the API call? So this is another, again, service-specific knowledge, understanding the use of something like a Cognito post-authentication trigger, for instance. Since we've decided that we're going to be using Cognito, we need to do something once the user signs in. This is an event-driven architecture. User signs in via Cognito. That event then triggers the invocation of some sort of API. Am I going to use API gateway to make an API call, or am I going to use Lambda to make an API call? This is where it could be a little tricky, but maybe not if we think through this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, API gateway, again, that service-specific knowledge comes in to where Lambda's looking like the better option to use with Cognito. What do you think, Danny?
Yeah, so if this question was asking me about hosting an API or having an API as part of my application, but all my application needs to do is just make an API call. And because of that, and knowing what my options might be for something like that Cognito post-authentication trigger, one of the triggers of that could be the invocation of a Lambda function. So with that, our answers here are A and E.
Did we spend 2 minutes on that?
I feel
Are
like
we
we
within
made
the time?
more than 2 minutes on that, but we had good reason, right? If we were in exam mode, we could go through that process a little bit quicker. But I think there's value here in just kind of talking through these here. So we'll do it one more time. Let's do one more sample question. A developer is working on an application that stores highly confidential data in a database. The developer must use AWS Key Management Service, KMS, with envelope encryption to protect the data. How should the developer configure the data encryption to meet these requirements? So we talked about envelope encryption a little bit earlier with the security domain. I think it's almost a certainty that you will see some sort of question involving either envelope encryption or client-side encryption, really understanding in detail how this process works when you need to encrypt data on the client side. Let's talk through these answer choices. So we have encrypt the data by using a KMS key, store the encrypted data in the database. Encrypt the data by using a generated data key, store the encrypted data in the database. Encrypt the data by using a generated data key, store the encrypted data and the data key ID in the database. And finally, encrypt the data by using a generated data key, store the encrypted data and the encrypted data key in the database. So looking through these answer choices, it looks like there's two parts to each of these answers. So if we see one part of this that's totally incorrect, we know we can rule that answer out. It looks like for the first half, it wants us to determine whether we're going to be encrypting the data by using a KMS key or by using a generated data key. So this is where knowing how envelope encryption works is important. How can we narrow down between those two based on the fact that it's envelope encryption?
Absolutely. So just to recap what envelope encryption is, it's really the practice of encrypting your data with a data key and then encrypting the data key under another key. So knowing that, where does that lead us? We need to store the encrypted form of the data key so that the data key can be used to decrypt the data, right?
Right. So we know that we're not using a KMS key in this case, because that's
Right.
not, so even though the question is saying the developer must use KMS with envelope encryption, we're not going to be using that KMS key to encrypt the data itself. We're going to be generating a data key to do that. So with that, we can rule out answer A. Then looking at B, C, and D, the only differences there are, do we store just the encrypted data in the database? Well, we know we probably need that data key as well at some point to be able to decrypt that data. So do we also need to store the encrypted data and the data key ID, or the encrypted data and the encrypted data key itself?
Well, I don't think the ID is going to do much for us.
No, I don't think so either. So again, knowing the process of envelope encryption, understanding that you do need to store both the encrypted data and the encrypted data key in the database will lead you to answer D. Anything else we want to add about going through these sample questions? Hopefully this process was instructive, seeing how we were able to rule out incorrect answers. Again, reading through those questions, seeing that the information that they're really asking us for tends to appear closer to the end of the question, and then kind of how we can start eliminating those distractors.
Absolutely. One thing I like to do too is just find the best keyword to describe the question. Like here, the best keyword phrase would be envelope encryption, right? And then based off of that, you can sort of get the answer to the question. Where as a previous question, the right one would have been automatic rotation. So just finding the right phrase to lead you towards the answer question, that might be helpful too. It helps me all the time when I take these exams.
Absolutely. So those were our sample questions. Let's take a little bit of a break from that, talk through some of the logistics for booking the exam. So if you've never booked an AWS certification exam before, you do need to create an AWS training and certification account. You can do that at the site that's on the screen here, aws.training/certification. Now that we are in calendar year 2023, you do have to book all of your certification exams through Pearson VUE. PSI used to be an option, but beginning January 1st of this year, all AWS exams are now using Pearson VUE. And you'll need 2 forms of identification, at least one of them being a government-issued photo ID. And we do still have the remote proctoring option available. Have you done any remote proctored exams, Alana?
I have, and I do have an opinion about them. When I took my DevOps Pro exam, I used remote proctoring, and it did add a little bit more stress to the process for me, just because with remote proctoring, you're being watched via a webcam during the exam, and they're watching you pretty thoroughly. So for example, when I read questions, I typically mouth the words of the question as I'm reading them. And the proctor, in my experience, called me out on it and said, you know, I wasn't even verbalizing them, but they said, stop mouthing the words or else we're going to have to stop your exam. And so that made it a bit stressful for me because I was hyper aware of what I was doing then and wasn't super focused on the exam itself. So keep in mind that little things like that might make it pretty stressful, as well as just managing things like your internet connection, you know, updates to your computer, things like that.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I had a similar experience with remote proctoring. I'm fortunate that I do live fairly close to a Pearson VUE test center, but definitely the advice I give anyone who asks, if you're within a reasonable drive to a physical testing center, it just eliminates so much of the risks. Like Alana mentioned, your computer installs an update and reboots itself, your network connection goes down, your power goes out, you have a screaming child in the background, or barking dogs or things like that. Any of those things could potentially be cause for the proctor to revoke your exam, and then starts a lengthy appeal process, and just some stressors that I would prefer to avoid and would recommend that you avoid by going to a testing center if at all possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had pretty positive experiences at testing centers, where you're in a very quiet area and nobody's bothering you. And so you might find it even more peaceful than your at-home environment.
And oftentimes at the testing center, I'll get an erasable whiteboard. And if you are taking the exam at home, remote proctored, you can't have any pen or paper or anything like that with you.
Right, right.
So that's booking the exam. Let's talk now about some of the differences between the DVA C02 exam and its predecessor, DVA C01. So the good news, if you've been preparing for this exam for a while, or maybe you had prepared to take it last year, something happened, you've had to postpone it for whatever reason, the good news is that that effort that you've spent studying potentially for the previous version of the exam was not in vain. It's not been wasted effort at all. This is a fairly incremental update from the DVA C01 exam based on what we've seen in the exam guides, and also based on what we've seen from some other AWS certification exams that have undergone similar refreshes in the past year. So that's been everything from the advanced networking specialty, the Solutions Architect Associate last summer, the Solutions Architect Professional last fall. All of these exams have undergone similar incremental updates. So the questions are going to be similar in complexity and scope. The only real difference, if you parse out the exam guide, there are about 24 new services that are considered quote unquote in scope for having questions asked about them. Those are services like AppConfig, the CDK, some of the systems manager tools, things like that. What we don't know yet, and we won't know until the exam has been released and we actually get an opportunity to sit the exam, how heavily are these new questions going to focus on these services? Are they just going to appear as distractors potentially? Will it be more just knowing at a memory recall level what these services are and do? We don't know that for sure yet. Based on what we've seen with some of the exams that refreshed last year, they tend to be at that recall level. So just knowing what these services are and what they do will probably be adequate on top of your existing knowledge. So if you look at the domains as broken down in the exam guide, you see the DVA C02 domains on the right that we just talked through. If you look at the predecessor exams domains on the left, you'll see domains 1 through 3, although they've been swapped, domains 1 and 3 have been swapped, those 3 are all basically the same. There's been some minor tweaks to the percentage weightings of those domains, but for all intents and purposes, development with AWS services, security, deployment, all of those things are being focused on roughly the same as they were in the prior version of the exam. The only real difference is that they've consolidated the refactoring domain and the monitoring and troubleshooting domain from DVA C01 into just a single troubleshooting and optimization domain. But as we talked through when we looked at the services in domain 4, those are the exact same services that were covered in domains 4 and 5 on the prior exam. So not a whole lot has changed. You see we do have a link to a blog post that we published last year when these exams were first announced, where we talk about this in further detail. But again, bottom line, if you've been studying for the prior version of the exam, or you've taken the prior version of the exam, maybe and you're due for recertifying, the questions are going to be similar in complexity and scope, and not a whole lot is going to have changed between these two versions of the exam. So now we'll talk about some of the frequently asked questions that we get here at Cloud Academy. So what should a novice know before taking this exam? So obviously you want to have an understanding of cloud computing. Maybe you have worked as a developer, but maybe not in a cloud-focused environment. You want to definitely understand how cloud computing works. And one recommendation that I like to make is if you're completely new to AWS and this is going to be your first AWS certification exam, consider pursuing the foundational level certification, the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner first. And I recommend that for a couple of reasons. One, it gets you familiar with how AWS exams work, how the questions are written, what the proctoring experience is like, etc. But also the Cloud Practitioner certification costs $100 US. And every time you pass an AWS certification exam, you get a voucher for 50% off your next certification exam. So we talked about this exam being $150. You paid that $100, you got the experience of taking the Cloud Practitioner certification, you got the cert. Now you have 50% off that you can apply to the $150 for this cert. Now you're paying $75 to sit your Developer Associate exam, and you already have a certification exam under your belt. So you have that experience, you have that exposure. You only paid $25 more, but now you come out of this with 2 certifications and all the more experience instead of just going right into the associate level. You certainly can. There's no prerequisites for these exams, but consider pursuing Cloud Practitioner first if it is your first certification.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in here and say from my own personal experience, that was really valuable to me. I took cloud practitioner certification first as well, and I felt like that gave me a really good context to how AWS tests, how they ask questions, and made me more comfortable with the test experience in general. So I wholeheartedly agree with that.
And then beyond that, obviously being aware of the core services within the different foundation areas. So you're going to see questions, as you saw in the sample questions that we talked through here, that touch on compute, storage, database, network, and security. And highly encourage you to familiarize yourself with the way that these questions are worded, their style, going through those sample questions, going through our learning paths here at Cloud Academy, going through our knowledge checks and our preparation exams. All of these things, the more experience you get in that timed environment, going through these questions, answering 65 questions in a sitting is going to prepare you for that exam experience. So how should you prepare for the exam? Well, give yourself plenty of time. You'll want to make sure that you're consuming all of the learning material that's available to you, ideally reviewing them more than once, particularly when you identify your weaker areas. And this is where going through sample questions can really start to help you identify, okay, I'm really strong in this area. Maybe I need to study the developer tool services a little bit more, things like that. There's no substitute. There's never any substitute for hands-on experience. Even for the associate level exams, AWS recommends that you have 1 year of hands-on experience with these services. Reach out and ask questions to people using AWS. Email us, support@cloudacademy.com. Leverage things like our Discord community, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But plenty of resources out there. Ask and study. And I'm pleased to announce that in the next few days, we will have a brand new learning path ready to prepare you for the DVA C02 exam. So stay tuned for more information about that. So looking at the live Q&A, I only see one question so far. The question is the remote proctoring optional? Yes, absolutely optional. So you will, when you go to the aws.training/certification page, you sign in with your account, you go to book that exam. The first thing that the Pearson VUE exam registration wizard is going to ask you is, do you want to take this exam via remote proctoring or in person at a test center? So you can absolutely choose in person at a test center. And it looks like that might be the only question we have. Definitely feel free to submit questions in the question window. But if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and move on. So again, I teased this already. We do coming soon. This will be live before the GA date of the exam, which we mentioned is February 28th. So by next Tuesday, keep an eye out on social media. We'll be definitely advertising and blasting out when that new learning path is live. We've got lots of new video courses, hands-on labs, hands-on lab challenges, knowledge checks, and a preparation exam to fully cover all of the services and the exam objectives as laid out in that exam guide that we talked through, and just fully prepare you to sit that exam. So stay tuned for that.
Yes, hands-on quizzes and lectures. What more could you want?
Absolutely. No substitute for it. And as I mentioned, we do have a Discord community. So feel free to sign up. There is a Discord invite link there on the screen. This is a growing community. I think we recently surpassed the 300 member mark. We'll probably be hitting 400 pretty soon. So highly encourage you to come here, ask your questions as you're studying. If you're stuck on anything, reach out to us. Our entire AWS content team is active on Discord. We'll also obviously be posting when we have that learning path released, as well as all of our new course releases. We also just talk a lot about AWS announcements and updates in general. But there are certification channels within that Discord where you can ask your certification specific questions, share your successes. We'd love to hear when you take the exam and you pass it. We definitely love getting that feedback as well. If there's anything you see questions about on the exam that maybe we need to cover more in our learning paths, we welcome that feedback as well.
Absolutely. Come say hi to us. Well, we're there almost every day.
Yes. So I do see we did have a few more questions come in here, and we do have a few more minutes. So does the learning path have a sample exam too? Yes, it absolutely will. So there will be knowledge checks along the way. You'll see very similar to how our current learning path for the DVA C01 exam is written. There will be knowledge checks on compute, storage, networking, database, etc. And then at the very end of the learning path, the very last item will be a full preparation exam. And that exam is great because the question bank is more than just 65 questions. So you can take that exam multiple times. You'll get different questions every time, and it will help to give you, again, that practice taking a full 65 question exam in a timed environment. When I started preparation for C01, better to pass that now or wait for the next version. So I don't believe it's actually possible to register for C01 anymore. It may be, but if it is, you would need to take that before next Monday. The 27th is the last day to sit C01. At this point, I would recommend just going for C02. Based on everything that we've seen, this should be, again, a very incremental update. All of the effort that you've put into studying for the C01 exam will still be relevant and apply to this exam as well. And the last question I see, can the C02 serve as a good entry point for a DevOps career on AWS? I'm a developer transitioning into DevOps. So absolutely, if you have that experience as a developer already and some hands-on experience with AWS as well, this is a great exam to sit and pass and then start focusing on the next level certification, the DevOps Engineer Professional, which will actually be hosting a webinar on next Wednesday. So encourage you to sign up for that as well, and we'll talk through some of the changes in that exam, but absolutely a great stepping stone there. To receive the exam coupon. So not that I'm aware of anything pertaining to this. I don't know specifically what you're referring to there for the exam coupon.
Is that referring to after you pass the cloud practitioner and you get the 50% off coupon potentially?
We'll assume that it is. So yeah, so when you pass a certification exam, you will have some member benefits that become associated with your training and certification account. That voucher is just a code that you then can apply at checkout when you register for the next version of the exam. And as far as I know, there's no expiration on those. I think I've used some that are at least 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah, I think I've had the same experience. Someone said they're taking the exam. That's exciting. Good luck. Please let us know how it goes. Hopefully,
yes, absolutely.
It goes great.
And it looks like that's all of our questions here. So definitely want to thank you all for joining us here today. And thank you, Alana, for joining me as well. Definitely appreciated your insights.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Without further ado, I will pass it back to Doina.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely session. A lot of new info. Really appreciate your time, Danny and Alana, and for sharing your expertise with us. So this concludes today's webinar. Don't forget to complete the survey at the end. It will help us improve our sessions. And like Danny already mentioned, don't forget to subscribe to our March 1st session. I'm sharing the link to register for that session. We will cover the AWS Certified DevOps Engineer Professional Certification update. Danny will be once again with us, along with our senior AWS content creator, Carlos Rivas. So Danny, Alana, you guys rocked. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day and see you in the next one.